Spy Cops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police who infiltrated over 1,000 campaign groups since 1968. Episode 28, Inquiry, Tranche 2, Preview. Welcome to Spy Cops Info Podcast. My name is Tom Fowler and I'm joined with
Evelyn Lavers. I'm with the Undercover Research Group.
And
Kate Wilson. I'm a core participant in the public inquiry.
And I'm Ben, another core participant.
Thanks for joining us. Right, Tranche 2 Phase 1 has already started. We've had the opening statements this week. The live evidence hearings are going to start on Monday. So we're going to do a bit of a preview of what to expect over the next few weeks of live evidence hearings. But just quickly before we do that, we should have a bit of a reflection on what was said in the opening hearings. There was a lot of apologies this week. Evelyn, what do you think of it?
Well, it makes you think why these apologies, and most of the apologies have all been made before. So it seems more like a kind of a PR exercise, like, oh, look, we aren't the bad guys, we're the good guys, we apologize. And also, it's quite easy to say when we start with more of the more recent relationships, like, been there, done that. We've apologized for that. We said can't be done, it shouldn't have been done. So let's talk about other things. Let's talk about other topics. Let's not go there. That is a bit scary.
Well, I think that from the very beginning, I mean, we've been at this for 14 years, and the police's approach consistently has been deny, delay, obfuscate until you really can't anymore, and then make admissions in order to try and make it go away and avoid the disclosure. So I think there might be an element of that. I mean, they said new stuff in their apologies. They repeated some of the apologies they've already made, but they did also say some new and quite significant stuff. They accepted corporate responsibility as the Metropolitan Police for some things. They also they talked about cultures of racism and sexism and misogyny, which was interesting. And they also talked about the culture of exceptionalism and impunity in the SDS. And I think that was quite interesting. What I think is happening, if you contrast the Metropolitan Police opening statement with the one that came after it, which is the statement made by lawyers on behalf of the ex-officers, is that they are noticeably unrepentant, and there seems to be a bit of a rift opening up there between the Metropolitan Police of today, who are clearly quite willing to throw their ex-employees under a bus, and the ex-SDS spy cops who are still saying, this was policing, this is what we were supposed to be doing. I think it's going to be quite interesting watching that play out.
I think there's also a slight shift towards them not only throwing the individual UCOs under the bus, but also pointing more of the blame at their managers. How far they're willing to go up the chain to throw them under the bus remains to be seen.
What we shouldn't forget either is that it was the very first time that the Metropolitan Police publicly acknowledged that Andy Coles had been in a relationship with Jessica. Jessica has been fighting for this for ages. She has had apologies from the police in person, and she has a settlement with the police. But Andy Coles, who's still a Tory councillor in Peterborough.
He lost his seat just a couple of months ago.
Yeah, okay, sorry, yeah. He has consistently denied having been in a relationship with Jessica, and he has said publicly that she's a liar and that he's being harassed by her and stalked and whatever, and that has caused trauma on trauma. And I think it was a big event for Jessica that for the first time they included her relationship or grooming her and misleading her, and some said that certainly had happened, as they have, like a couple of years ago. That should he have been a police officer still, he would have had a case to answer, but he consistently denies it. But that's going to be finished from now on.
There's loads more information about what happened during the opening statements. There's a long article on the Police Spies Out of Lives website. I'll put a link to it in the show notes.
The opening statement on behalf of the CND, which was amazing. A lot of work had been done. I wish I had done that. Was my kind of work. Because the lawyers or I don't know, maybe just the police themselves apparently looked into what was known about the police and MI5, the intelligence service, spying on the peace movement, and they kind of put together the statements of the undercover who was in the movement and in which branch or wherever, and what had become known from a couple of whistleblowers that happened to be on the desk that dealt with the CND at the time. So they could put together that at the time there was a big scandal about the whistleblowing and the case, and that the CND had been spied on. But as we have found out now, the whistleblowing only went that far so far because it never talked about the undercover officers that were sort of infiltrated actual branches of the CND. And as it turned out, there was a big scare and a panic within the STS and Special Branch at the time that the existence of the STS would be sort of out in the open. And I think that's very good work to sort of add a layer to what we can learn from all the spy reports and the deployments. You also can see where the reports of the undercover landed and who dealt with them at the desk on the other side, and that happened to be a whistleblower. That was quite amazing to see.
I would add that something that came up a lot in the opening statements, but kind of we're going to increasingly see the result is pretty much everyone in their opening statements, apart from the police, and even them actually, talked about the delays that are causing quite a crisis in people's ability to participate in the inquiry. Delays of disclosure, late disclosure, meaning that people can't examine the evidence and incorporate what they've read into their statements. So the inquiry is already missing out on critical stuff, and that problem looks like it's going to become increasingly worse. And of course, now we have a new government and a new Home Secretary, and they may have different opinions about how to support the inquiry in reaching a thorough investigation as time goes by.
Go back to what Evelyn was talking about with the CND statement. I think the CND statement was absolutely fascinating. It was full of a lot of really key examples of how political these undercover operations were and ideologically motivated. And Kate Hudson of CND is going to be giving evidence on the 15th of July. And I think that's definitely going to be one to watch. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Should we go through the days as they go? It starts on Monday. Hopefully this podcast should come out on Sunday. So tomorrow, if you're listening straight away, we start off with Dave Morris, who was denied giving his usual opening statements because of some petty technicalities from the inquiry. He'll be giving evidence on Monday morning. We've heard him a few times with his opening statements, but this is the first time he'll be questioned. And then we've got an unusual thing, starting with Monday afternoon. We've got, representing Friends of Freedom Press, we've got the Aldergate Press Director, Steve Sorber, be giving his witness, his live evidence. That will be under restriction order, so they will be able to attend, and the people who have got access will be able to watch live. It won't be broadcast on the YouTube channel as most of the other hearings will be. There will be a transcript released afterwards, and a video will be released later in the week, but it won't be live. The same goes for day 5, which will be the questioning of HN85, real name Roger Pierce, who used the name Roger Thorley when he infiltrated Freedom Press and other anarchist groups between 78 and 84. This will be under restriction order, so we won't be able to report on it live, which is frustrating. It's something that's come from a civilian member of the inquiry, so it's a non-state court participant who's obviously going to be named in some manner by Roger Pierce. It's totally understandable that members of the public don't want to have themselves dragged through the mud by these professional liars. It does raise challenges for those of us who are following the inquiry. I think Roger Pierce is liable to be one of the more interesting witnesses. He's a former undercover officer who went on to be very senior within the Met, indeed, not only leading the SDS, but also Special Branch in general and head of intelligence for the Met, before going on to be security director for GE Capital, and then becoming this author of pulp fiction paperbacks based largely, would appear on his undercover background, though incredibly sort of sexed up. So you'd kind of hope that he wouldn't be able to use the idea that he didn't remember anything about it as a defence. I think it's perfectly understandable there's a restriction, that somebody's applied for the restriction order, though it does make us difficult to follow.
I do understand, we've seen in the past, and no doubt this will happen again now, is that, Roger Pierce has written, I think, 300 reports, and with many of the UCOs, they kind of, let's use the term, sex up their reports, so they make their own deployment more important than it effectively was, by claiming all kind of things happened, or anarchists, at quotation marks, had all kind of plans, and they all kind of were involved in this and that. People were named, registry files, Secret Service files were opened on their name, and people were implied in all kind of things just to make the work of the UCOs very important. And I can very much imagine that 40 years later, you're now maybe working as a teacher or working somewhere else, and you just don't want your name and what the UCO says you did splashed out on the front pages. So the restriction order came off very late yesterday, in fact, which has everything to do with all the delays, I guess, that people only got to read the material on the very last moment before the hearing start. And as I said, there were loads of reports that Roger Pierce wrote, and before you through everything, and before you've seen where your name pops up, you get to the very last moment.
Yeah, just to explain to listeners, UCOs, which Evelyn keeps using, is a bit of legalese. It means undercover officer, like the spy cops, essentially.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
He's only going to be giving evidence in this tranche about this tranche, and I think he ought to be being called back to speak as a manager, because it's obviously very significant that he was an undercover officer and went on to be a manager. That's going to be a recurring theme, and it's going to be particularly interesting in Tranche 2, Part 2, when we start looking at officers like Bob Lambert and Andy Coles. But Thorley is one of these officers who was undercover and then went on to run stuff, and he got very high up. There won't be live access, but the inquiry have said they will be publishing a video of the evidence. So I presume they will check it and edit it to make sure whatever shouldn't be said under the restriction order is not in there, and then they are going to put it up. So you can't follow it live, but you will be able to watch the video. It's been specifically said with regard to Roger Thorley that his reporting was actually quite scandalous, like the tone and the way that he talks about people, and that's something that is going to be particularly studied. The inquiry, I believe, have said they're going to be particularly looking at comparing the different undercover officer reports, and there's a shocking lack of professionalism if you know, just standing aside and whatever you think about the SDS or undercover policing, the way that these officers were reporting it's gossipy, it's unpleasant, it's, giving their personal
Misogynist, racist.
So yes, I think it's definitely very understandable that 40 years later people don't want some arsehole cop's opinions about them put in the public domain. And I think it's going to be quite interesting looking at that point of the kind of tone that was used in lots of reporting, but I think Thorley's in particular.
Yeah, when it comes to covering it, I think my plan is to write my reactions, not tweet them live. Obviously, I won't be allowed to, but to write the reactions, and then when they release the video, I'll do a watch along and release the text that I would have, the tweets that I would have put out when it was happening live. Then I'll probably do the same with some live reaction video. Maybe have to edit afterwards if we make any mistakes with some of the information that we've heard. But sort of cover it as live when the inquiry deigns to release it to everyone. So then Wednesday, the 10th of July, the next day, day 6, will be entirely given over to the evidence hearings of Michael Chant, who is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain, Marxist-Leninist, and was a member of the Communist Party of England, which was its predecessor, infiltrated by, most notably by two officers, HN13, Barry Loader, Desmond Loader, who's now dead, and HN19, cover name Malcolm Shearing. The inquiry suggested it particularly wants to ask questions about the way in which HN19 encouraged the crowd to break the lines in a demonstration against the National Front.
What's interesting about the police spying on the Maoists is this issue with the MI5 and the relationship between the SDS and MI5 and this whole idea of reporting on subversive groups. And some of the stuff that's going to be coming out in this tranche is quite interesting. Of course, this tranche spans the end of the Cold War and quite a dramatic change in the relationship between the SDS and MI5. And there's, I think, going to be quite a lot of evidence about that interplay and whether groups were considered to be subversive or not. And I mean, particularly Marxist-Leninist group in question, I think MI5 basically took them off the subversive lists, and yet there were two police officers in the group. There's quite a lot of interesting stuff around how the state spied on political groups during the Cold War and this whole idea of subversion and what utter bollocks it actually was.
The question is, will we hear about that from him?
So he is due, Michael Shearing, HN19, is due to be given a witness statement the next day, on the Thursday the 11th.
Yeah.
He'll be in the afternoon. In the morning, first off, we'll be hearing from Francis Bennett, whose brother, Michael Hartley, was one of the people who died as an 18-year-old in his case, and whose identity was stolen by HN12, who infiltrated the Revolutionary Communist Group and Socialist Workers' Party between 82 and 85. He had a sexual relationship whilst deployed undercover, prosecuted and fined for a minor offence under Michael Hartley's identity. He died in March 2018, but the inquiry has decided to give anonymity, even in death, to the officer, which is something we've seen again and again. It's quite sad. But hopefully, then in the afternoon, then we'll have the Malcolm Shearing, or cover name Malcolm Shearing rather, whether he does the memory loss bingo. We wait and see.
There's kind of two sides to the stuff coming out in this tranche. On the one hand, you have like the sort of the political stuff, the ideological background, and the whole kind of conservative establishment trying to crush political dissent. And then on the other, you've just got the utter moral bankruptcy of these individuals in stealing dead people's identities and having these abusive relationships undercover. And there's kind of this. Yeah, I think it's going to be quite painful to listen to some of that evidence, just the utter awfulness of these people.
Genuinely ghoulish. That'll be it for week 2. It ends, on the Thursday, not sitting on the Friday. We'll probably do another podcast episode that week, probably looking at Roger Pierce, but depends on when the information about that day of hearing comes out. Might have to put that off till a bit later. And then we'll come back on week 3 with, as Kate mentioned earlier, Kate Hudson representing the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. She'll be being questioned on Monday the 15th. That should be an interesting one.
Well, I think the big news in that, as far as like listening to the opening statement, what is this thing of so you had information coming out at the time about the spying on CND, but it's got a lot worse, and it, it's much bigger than anyone thought. And there's particularly this issue of the way that Michael Heseltine, who was Minister of Defence at the time, specifically tasked and used the SDS to gather dirt on people and use it in marginal seats in the 1983 general election. So what you've got is secret political police, going out and gathering dirt for the Tory party election campaign to undermine the opposition, which, like, I find it particularly ironic because you see Mitting asking people over and over again, was the group that you were involved in intending to subvert parliamentary democracy? Actually, the clearest examples that we've had so far of subverting parliamentary democracy have actually been the SDS and not the groups that they were spying on at all. I mean, my personal views on subverting parliamentary democracy and the whole concept of referring to Parliament as democratic in the first place is a different matter. But, even just taking the mindset of the public inquiry, the SDS were quite clearly and identifiably doing things that undermined the principles of parliamentary democracy in a way that the people they were spying on were not.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is something we tie ourselves in knots in sometimes when we're covering the inquiry because, I don't believe in parliamentary democracy. I'm all for subversion. I'm pro-subversion, right? I'm a fucking revolutionary, politically. And all of us sometimes can get stuck in these little cul-de-sacs of, using reasonable argument and shit, which, is not who we are necessarily, right? But we're judging things by their own sort of standards within what the inquiry actually stands for and is.
So I think that these examples are really crucial example of what the information that the SDS gathered was actually used for. It's not used to just put it on a shelf where there are 5 somewhere, but we had those in Tranche 1 as well. There are these secret committees at the Home Office or joint committees where strategies are being made to undermine the left and to smear the left, to organize blacklisting. And here again, it's purely, like Kate said, purely political use of this info. It's political policing. It's the police. It's supporting the state's agenda, the right-wing agenda. And I think we shouldn't forget that, with all the scandals of the dead children and the relationships and all that, the fact that there was a political policing unit active since 1968 to undermine the left and to follow the corporate and conservative agenda is indeed very important. And this is a really good example that I hope we're going to hear more about.
So we'll be hearing the next day from HN65, John Kerry, or possibly used the name Anthony Keir, who was targeting CND between 1980 and 84. Pretty much everything I know about him I learned from the opening statement. That should be interesting. That's a whole day of that. Then moving on to day 10, which is the Wednesday, the 17th. We'll be hearing from 2 female activists who we heard from the lawyer of during the opening statements, Hilary Moore and Jane Hickman, who were members of Lambeth Women for Peace and were involved with Greenham Common, Women's Peace Camp. They were both their lives were infiltrated by HN33. Catherine Leslie Lee Bonza was her cover name, between 83 and 87. We were hoping to hear from HN33 herself, and she was in fact on the original list of undercover officers who would be called to give evidence in this phase of hearings. She won't be. Turns out, because she lives abroad, the inquiry is unable to force her to give evidence. She decides she doesn't want to, so she won't be coming, which I think is a massive hole in what the inquiry is going to be covering on this.
This is going to be interesting evidence. So what we've got here, the counsel to the inquiry in his opening statement pointed out that all but one of the officers in this T2 period were white, and we'll get on to that in a bit, and all but one were men. And Lee Bonza, HN33, is the one woman. She, from what we've heard this week, was headhunted specifically to spy on Greenham Common. It was one of those spaces like we heard from the officer who was spying on the Women's Liberation Front, where the misogynist white men just couldn't get in, and so they headhunted a woman, and she was told that she was being sent in there because the Prime Minister wanted to know what the Greenham women were doing. Of course, Prime Minister of the day was Margaret Thatcher, who did have a particular vendetta against quite a lot of the political left. And I think again, that whole period, which is what we're looking at now in Tranche 2, covering Thatcher's war against the unions and against the peace movement. And I think we're going to see. So, I mean, stuff to add to your bingo cards, really. So we're going to see a lot more of officers spreading divisions within the groups that they were spying on. We're going to see a lot more evidence of, government involvement, like direct government tasking. We've got Heseltine, we've got Thatcher involved in directly asking the police to gather this dirt.
Also, I mean, I think it's turned out this HN33 pulling out set a precedent, because the next day was meant to be HN88, who used the cover name Timothy Spence. He infiltrated Hackney, basically. I mean, he was literally not tasked with a particular group to infiltrate, just to go to Hackney and get involved with whatever, infiltrate a whole bunch of different groups. But he's managed to avoid coming to give evidence as well. There's another officer then later on, actually, and I worry that there's a real precedent being set here of officers realising that if they're not in the country at the time of the hearings, they can avoid coming to give evidence.
I think it's quite important to say that if you look at the way that the inquiry has responded to this, they make these quite dry comments like HN88 has declined to give evidence and cannot be compelled. It's absolute bollocks. The inquiry does have the power to compel these people, though I think it's Section 21 of the Inquiries Act, and if they're out of the country, obviously it can't be enforced, but as soon as they come back into the country, they would be picked up and required to give evidence. The government, but the inquiry does have the power to compel them. It's choosing not to, and I think that doesn't come across in their descriptions of these officers not giving evidence. And we've got a particularly nasty one coming up in part 2 of Tranche 2, which is John Dines, also abroad, and has also declined to give evidence. And he's going to be a particularly interesting officer, and it's scandalous that they're being able to get away with saying they don't want to tell the truth and not being compelled to do so.
Week 4. So that's all for that week because of the pullouts, and it's still a short week. So week 4 starts with the evidence of HN25, who used the false name Kevin Douglas and infiltrated the Troops Out movement between 87 and 91. We heard a lot about the Troops Out movement and Rick Gibson's infiltration of them in the 1970s during Tranche 1.
Yeah, I thought it was particularly striking, and I didn't actually realise at the time. So when counsel to the inquiry made their opening statement, like they were sort of going through talking about, this obsession that the inquiry has with finding reasons why the deployments were justified. And for the section about the spying on the Troops Out movement, counsel to the inquiry, David Barr, basically read a long list of IRA bombings and terrorist attacks throughout the T2 period. And it was a bit like, where is he going with this? And are we suddenly going to find out that, the SDS were infiltrating the provisional IRA or whatever? And then he was like, the SDS infiltrated the Troops Out movement, who were an entirely peaceful campaign movement, as far as we heard in T1. And, it was felt in T1 that it absolutely was not justified to have been spying on the Troops Out movement. And that list actually came from the entirely unrepentant opening statement of the ex-SDS officers who included it. He'd edited the list. They included a very, very long list of things that happened in the T2 period that must be taken into account as the background. Most of it was ignored by counsel to the inquiry, but he did pull out this long list of terrorist attacks in order to kind of link them to the Troops Out movement, which I found really quite offensive. And I think, it's worth looking at that evidence just to contrast the way that it was presented by the inquiry in the opening statements to the actual evidence that's going to be heard about spying on that group.
It's a classic tactic. I mean, they still use it now, right? With like the Gaza protesters being accused of being like Hamas supporters, like peace activists being accused of being the terrorists or supporters of terrorism. That's the same thing for the Troops Out movement and the IRA then.
It's interesting because this is something that really came up, and I know I'm always going on about the IPT documents, but it's what I know most about. But there was a real tone in the authorizations for some of the later deployments where they basically just list extremist stuff, or even not extremist stuff that they just call extremist, but they just list loads of extremist stuff and completely neglect to draw any real links between that and what they're really choosing to spy on. But you just kind of, just throw a whole load of, bombings and murders and things out there, not actually related to the spying that was going on or the groups that were being spied on, but it happened, and that kind of shapes the narrative and shapes people's understandings of it. And it's kind of like, throw a lot of mud and maybe some of it will stick.
Yeah, I think I might use something like that in one of my my own statement. I'll just list a long list of murders and deaths in custody by the police, which have nothing at all to do with MPOAU on me, and then segue into them raiding my squat or something.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds fair enough. It sounds like the way that the inquiry's run. I mean, if the counsel of the inquiry can do it, then why can't anybody else? Another callback to Tranche 1 will have Lindsay German will reappear. She was last in Tranche 1 Phase 3, giving evidence. She's being questioned again about the infiltration of the Socialist Workers' Party. I mean, we get the impression we're going to have this situation where civilian witnesses are asked to come back repeatedly to give evidence. It doesn't appear clear whether they'll be doing that with the undercover cops, although they should do, seeing they span Roswell's tranches.
That, we've got this big question over Roger Thorley and whether he's going to be called back. I believe they've actually said that Trevor Morris is not going to be called back. And again, we'll get to him in a bit.
Then on day 12, we've got HN90, who used the cover name Mark Kerry between 88 and 92, infiltrating the SWP, the Socialist Workers' Party, and City of London anti-apartheid group. Then we were meant to have HN122, who went by the stolen identity Neil Richardson, who was deployed between 89 and 93, infiltrated class war and the RCP. However, the inquiry has changed its mind about this session, and now HN122 will not be appearing during this phase, but will return in a later phase, supposedly, unless he manages to wriggle out of it in some way.
I wonder if you actually have to move abroad or just be on holidays. That's sufficient to be unable to be compelled?
I mean, that's what I get the impression it is, right? I mean, maybe that's me just assuming, but I assume it's just leaving the country for when the hearing's happening. Because on the Wednesday, we haven't got HN12 giving evidence because he's going to supposedly come back later, though we'll wait and see if that actually happens. We'll be hearing from HN56, who's quite an interesting one. Used the alias Alan Nicholson, deployed between 90 and 91, infiltrating the British National Party. Bit of a departure from all the other undercover officers we've heard so far, seeing that he infiltrated the far right. Everybody else we've heard about has been exclusively targeting left-wing progressive groups. However, from what we've heard from the opening statements and what his lawyers have said, his level of infiltration was very superficial. It would seem that he was in a fairly moribund group who weren't very active for a short period of time, and claims to have lived in fear that he was going to be outed by a fellow undercover officer whilst he was deployed. But it should be interesting. It's a different angle. We got the impression there wouldn't be any of these officers giving evidence, but there is one. So, I mean, it'll certainly be different.
I think it's going to be really interesting just for that reason of kind of comparing his deployment to the really long-term, deep infiltrations of the extreme left. And I think it also begs a question that needs to be posed to the inquiry, which is that, this is ideological political policing. I think by the end of this tranche, it's going to be impossible for anybody to conclude anything else. And Mitting is specifically said in his interim report in June 2023, which was, very, very critical of the SDS. But he specifically said that he had decided not to consider the, kind of wild conspiracy theory. There's something about his tone that suggests that he kind of feels that the idea that these police units could have been set up by the conservative establishment in order to undermine the progressive left, he hadn't even bothered to look at that. Because, and I think, it's going to become clearer that really is what was going on. But one of the things that I think is particularly noticeable about the inquiry is you will see all of the people who were spied on being interviewed, not being interviewed, being questioned, cross-examined about their political beliefs. And what you don't see is the police being examined about their political beliefs. And I think that phrase that you just said about how, the officer that infiltrated the far right, unlike any of the officers in the far left, was terrified that fellow officers were going to out him to the group. Because there were a lot of fellow officers who were in the BNP. There was a lot of far right feeling in the police. There's an ongoing culture of racism that the Met Commissioner apologised for again and said it continues to be a challenge in the Metropolitan Police. Basically, a lot of them are still fascists. And the inquiry's not going there. There's kind of this idea that, they're police officers, they're just doing their jobs, whereas, our politics are relevant. And I think we need to be asking that question a lot more of what was the politics of the officers, these guys who are in the SDS, what was their ideological position, what was their... you'll see that I think it's all quite interesting.
Right. I think, but the most interesting, most explosive, possibly, is going to be the final week of evidence. Starts on Monday, the 29th of July, with the evidence of two women, B and Jenny. B, who had a year-long relationship with the undercover officer, Trevor Morris, and Jenny, who had a much shorter sexual encounter with the same officer while he was deployed. Followed by, there'll be a 2-day break, and then 2 days of questioning of Trevor Morris himself. This is HN78, used the false name Anthony Bobby Lewis, was deployed between 91 and 95, infiltrated the Socialist Workers' Party, the Anti-Nazi League, most notably spied on the family of Stephen Lawrence as this family justice campaign. Notably one of the only black officer, which Kate mentioned earlier. There's only one black officer in this tranche. As far as we know, it's the only black officer so far. That should be... particularly given the groups that he was infiltrating, it wasn't just the Stephen Lawrence campaign, but also other family justice campaigns, and the fact that there was a sexual relationship, and we'll be hearing from the two women who he had sexual relationships with. This should be probably the most newsworthy of this phase, the final week.
There's a lot to say about Trevor Morris. I think that the sexual relationships with both B and Jenny, we heard stuff in the opening statements that really highlight some of the issues around these relationships. So the first thing is there's a point that B makes about how early on in the deployment the relationship happened, and also just about him, the way that she was used as part of his cover story, and the cynicism of that. At the time, B was a single mother with very young children, and she makes this point. She makes the point about her own children in her opening statement, but also about Trevor Morris's children, and the fact that, whilst he was with her, he had his own family that he was neglecting, and just like some of the cynicism and just the how sad some of these stories are as well. And then at the other end of the spectrum. And at the other end of the deployment, we have the relationship that he had with Jenny. They were close friends. And, she felt that she'd formed a intimate friendship with this man. And he deceived her into a one-night stand on what was pretty much the last night of his deployment. And what the point that she makes is that there's just no possible operational benefit to that. Like, it is just opportunistic, using his position of power and abusing his role for sexual gratification. So I think, I always find it quite unpleasant talking about this stuff, but I think it's really important to call it so that people can see what these men were doing. And there was a question that came up during my trial that the police at some point in their defence made a particularly absurd point in their own defence, where they said, Mark Kennedy actually went on to have sexual relationships after he left the police force in his cover identity. So it clearly wasn't anything to do with the culture of the police. It was because, he did it when he wasn't police as well. Which is kind of laughable and ridiculous. But it's all, there was this question that was raised about, was it a part of the job? Was it a tactic? Or was it a perk of the job and just, men abusing positions of power? And one of the judges said, well, I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. It's both. And I think that Bobby Lewis is a very good example of that. And if you look at, the deployment and the evidence from Beat and Jenny, you really see it, that there is this kind of confluence of interests, let's say, between male sexual predators and unscrupulous policing. And then, we come to Trevor Morris, as you said, the one black man in the force. And I think one of the things that's quite interesting is that he has apparently, and I haven't seen his witness statement yet, and I think it's going to be interesting when it comes to evidence, but he's apparently complained of racism in the police. Yeah. That he wasn't given a commendation. We'll be hearing quite a lot about, commissioners' commendations given to undercover officers. I know Bob Lambert got one. I don't know, not sure who else, but there's a few instances of it. Bobby Lewis, Trevor Morris, notably didn't, and he says that was because he was black. And it reminded me a bit of he was out there infiltrating anti-racist campaigns whilst suffering racism at work. And I was reminded of the woman who was sent to infiltrate the Women's Liberation Front, where
Sandra,
yes, we heard from her in Tranche 1, and she was infiltrating, among other things, campaigns for equal pay. And she was asked, were you paid the same as your male undercover colleagues? And she wasn't. She only got 20% of what they were being paid because she was a woman. And it just, the mind boggles. What did these people think they were doing? That's going to be the accusations of racism coming from the only black officer in the SDS in this tranche.
I think there will be quite a lot of interesting stuff. It is really easy to see those parallels with HN 348. Just somebody who's being fucked over by their employers and looking to fuck over people who would probably have better interests for them at heart. Yeah, I think Trevor Morris, like the fact he's got 2 days, suggests there's a great deal more to come out. It's quite unusual for the inquiry to do that with questioning of an undercover officer. I don't think we've seen that before, setting aside that much time for an officer.
It's also going to be interesting because, as you said, he spied on the Stephen Lawrence campaign, but that was late. So that's moving into Tranche 3, and it's not clear yet. I don't think people have received disclosure, as far as I know, about his spying on the Lawrences, about his activities in Tranche 3. But the inquiry have, I believe, said that they don't intend to call him back in Tranche 3. So there's a bit of back and forth about that, because obviously the people who he was spying on in Tranche 3 want to be able to question him about that, but haven't yet been given the material to be able to do. So I wonder how much of that is going to come out, and I think we need to keep the pressure on to make sure that he is brought back to talk about what may be some of the most controversial stuff that he did politically.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a common theme of just, the information not being released to those it's affected in a timely manner. And the police, the inquiry is just doing things out of order with police. I mean, we've already heard of stuff where officers who were given evidence in the first tranche have now shown to have been lying by evidence that's come out in the second tranche. But there's no question of them being called back, which is a farce.
Yes, I mean, I think we need to stay quite on top of all that stuff in order to be able to bring it all out in the closing statements and make really clear that, and as it's quite complicated because, we've seen the opening statement and they've said, it was all unjustified, and, omitting in the opening statement highlighted 4 particular areas of concern about these officers. So we've got people entering private homes and, without warrants and kind of ignoring trespass laws. We've got officers taking positions of authority in the groups that they were targeting. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in this tranche. And I think it really need to press home the significance of that, because this is about, we're seeing that these were ideologically motivated operations, and this is about these officers actually getting into positions of influence in the groups and being able to manipulate the political direction. And there was an interesting example from one of the infiltrators of CND that I think we're going to hear about, where there was National CND were sent out as kind of survey to all the groups, asking whether it was thought that they should take part in a trip to Moscow. Of course, this is during the Cold War. Only 2 of the local groups replied on that. And one of the replies actually came from one of the undercover officers saying that, yes, he did support the idea of CND going to Moscow. Taking positions of influence, I think, is interesting. And the other things that they talked about were forming of very close personal relationships, including sexual relationships. And I think, again, it's important to stress that, the intimacy. I mean, if you look at the Jenny's evidence, right until the last day of Trevor Morris's deployment, they weren't in a sexual relationship, but it was a very close relationship. It was an intimate relationship. And I think there's a lot of people who maybe never had sex with these officers, but were taken into really intimate, trusting, traitorous relationships. And the 4th thing that he called was the stealing of dead children's identities. And then, we've had the Metropolitan Police at the beginning of this tranche, kind of even going a bit further, really, and talking about failures in management and cultures of exceptionalism and impunity and racism and misogyny and, all the apologies that we heard. And so, it starts to feel a bit odd that we're still going, this inquiry's crap and it's not fit for purpose. But I think it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning of that once they can no longer delay the truth coming out any further, and once they can no longer obfuscate and deny the stuff that was going on, they go for this making kind of quite broad brush of admissions that avoid a real examination of the detail and the truth. And I think a little bit what we're seeing now is that going on. So the inquiry is kind of, they're still talking about the justification for these operations, but the tone had changed, I felt, in the opening statements, and it no longer feels like they actually think they're going to find much justification for these operations. So they're now going for this kind of, admit and apologise, but still trying to avoid a proper in-depth investigation. And that's where, giving the people the disclosure at the absolute last minute comes in, and that's where kind of dialing back on who they're going to be calling to give evidence and dialing back on what kind of things they're going to be investigating going forward. And, Ben was mentioning earlier about the Home Office deadlines and the way that basically, the conclusions, I'm increasingly thinking that the conclusions of this inquiry are going to be pretty damning for the police, but the investigations that are undertaken are getting less and less robust. And what that means is, it says when you're talking about human rights abuses, it's all very well to say, well, yeah, they're abuse to human rights. But actually what this inquiry is really about is making sure this stuff doesn't happen again. And that's the part where you actually need to know the details of what was done and why it was wrong, rather than just kind of broad brush, it was unjustified or it was badly managed, or how was it badly managed? What was unjustified about what they were doing? We still need to be pushing. It feels odd to say that an inquiry that's basically finding that they were morally bankrupt and that it wasn't justified is not fit for purpose, but the purpose isn't just to make those kind of declarations. The purpose is actually to get to the truth.
That was the end of the hearings, this phase. I'll be there in person for the whole of the hearings. Evelyn, you'll be there in person for all the hearings?
Looking forward to it. There will be long days.
Ben and Kate, you'll be following closely. There'll be a bunch of other people there. We'll be on the ground. You can follow us on Twitter by just following the hashtag SpyCops. There'll be some more podcast episodes. We'll be doing some video, probably in the SpyCops Info Facebook group. Probably post it a few other places as well. If you'd like to support, please just help share all the content that comes out. We can add you to a Telegram group and a load of other things. Get in touch if you've got any questions, if you'd like to appear, speak anywhere else on the other podcasts or meetings or whatever.
We'll see you at the demo on Monday morning.
Yes, yeah. So if you hear this in time on the Monday morning, we're at a protest outside. So come join us at the International Dispute Resolution Centre, next door to St Paul's Cathedral, round the corner from the Stock Exchange. We'll be there. We're protesting outside from 8:45 on Monday. If you make it, if it's after this audit, then we'll still be there. But follow us on all the socials. I'm at Tom B. Fowler. I'm mostly Twitter for this stuff. But just follow the hashtag SpyCops. You'll find everything. You can support me on Ko-fi. It's ko-fi.com/Tom B. Fowler. Thanks for listening.